Good evening, it's Joyful Hermit, a little after 3 in the morning, and I really had a good stretch of sleep, maybe about 3 or 4 hours, so I'm very thrilled. I'm trying for a third time for a video because the last one I kept falling asleep in. And I don't really have that much to say other than something that really struck me, and it hit me profoundly over the last several days. And it had to do with watching something very temporal on a sports channel, and somebody that I know very well, but I know the background history of the situation, and I realized that this person was teaching me something very beautiful and very simple, but somehow in my life I had missed out on. And maybe it was in the 80s to be left and single in the 80s, 1980s, was a different time period for a woman. And I don't know, but I think I became a fighter, and not necessarily in a useful way, but so many people taking advantage at that time period, and life was difficult. And so I learned to stand up for myself. I think part of it was the conditions of the marriage ending also, is that I realized I had been mistreated and taken advantage of in a cheating way, untruth, and gradually put down and put down and put down. But times have changed, and I noticed in this person this past weekend, and a little bit different situation, but it was of the power that God gives us when we love and forgive. and it's not that I didn't in the 80s or anything, but I became more a stood up for myself type person, which is a good thing to do. It's fine. But the excuse me, loving and forgiving is very, very powerful. And there's nothing wrong with letting things go and just simply loving and forgiving, retaining relationships, even though they aren't positive, knowing the situation. I guess I can liken it to David with Saul, or David against Goliath. There was a wisdom used, an intuitive wisdom of what was needed to win or to stand up for oneself. And and with Saul, David found out that Saul despised him, and David had always honored and looked up to Saul, and was best friends with Saul's son Jonathan. But David was loving and forgiving, and gave Saul every benefit of the doubt possible, and did not cut off the relationship when he could have. He had a right to. That one point in the cave, he could have slaughtered Saul. Saul was planning to kill David, and he knew it. David knew it. But David showed mercy and love and forgiveness. And eventually, though, God handled the situation with Saul. But it was just a profound example to me of observing this person in a sport who had been wronged. Well, it was a breach of confidence, a breach of trust situation. And yet the person forgave. And worked at retaining a friendship, such as it was, but still a amenable type of relationship that was discussed even publicly by an announcer. And I was stunned because I thought, well, that's the person who had backstabbed. But I was thrilled in a way because it struck me about the beauty and the power of forgiving others. It gives the person who forgives a type of graciousness. People like peace. They like peace. They don't like battling and upset and fighting. But then again, there are times when we must stand up against wrongs, such as a person who has witnessed something that was wrong in the workplace and is standing up against that, notified his own superior, who, for basically office politics and ease of his own or her own position, decided not to act on the report of wrongdoing in the office setting. But this person is going to continue to take it above this other person's level to try to help get justice for someone who was wronged by a supervisor. And ironically, I'd found out about that situation and was praying for the person who was going into war over it. And righteously so, because there's an innocent person, a younger employee who was set up and given the hatchet because that person's supervisor had gripes against the person, didn't want the person around. It served this other person's purposes better to terminate the employee. So that person lied about the employee in order to terminate, in order to justify it. Well, I don't know what happened to the employee that was terminated. We don't know how that affected the person. Maybe they won't be able to get another job because one of the charges was very volatile in our time period and could ruin a person for years, or at least in a certain job area, and only if someone took pity and risk would hire the person. So it's a matter of sometimes we must fight for justice for an innocent person who has no ground to stand on. And in those cases, it's a righteous good to stand up and say, this is what happened. I witnessed this wrong going on. Even though it puts the person who is the whistleblower in a difficult position, could end up on the outs also, him or herself. But it's an interesting scenario that we can get into with people who are choosing to do wrong and to do wrong. We don't know yet how it will turn out in this one particular situation. So we have different situations in which we go forward in our lives, go forth into battle with what is not right, as opposed to what is a righteous battle in what we end up in noticing or fighting against something that is a person wronging another person. Behind all of it, behind our actions or situations in our lives, are people who are trying to bring justice, truth, beauty, and goodness out of situations. And we go forward in whatever way we can that is moral and just and proper on behalf of other people, with hopes and prayers that right will rise to the top, right will occur. So I don't know, I've just found it a fascinating situation, and more than fascinating, one of right action over wrong action in various situations. So, doing what is right for someone who has been wronged can be a very noble task. And it brings to mind victim souls yet again. There are situations in our lives that it is best to take up the place for someone, take up the position for someone who deserves to be defended. And we choose what's best in any given situation. So, I was thinking again about the victim soul situation and the power of love and the power of forgiveness. Sometimes with people we don't know, but we witness a situation that we stand up and say, okay, this is enough of this type of activity, and I'm going to speak up about it. So how we do that kind of task, where we stand up for righteousness' sake, which is something that I experienced recently also. So I have these situations that I'm just sharing with you. The one which shows me the power of love and forgiveness over those who have been wronged, and then the other situation in which someone is wronged and we're going to go on to war to defend them, to try to help right and wrong stand out, and for love and forgiveness to prevail. And when we can bring about love and goodness and righteousness, it's a beautiful experience for us. And it's not often that it really falls into place one way or another so easily as the examples I've just shared. But they're good examples, and we will it's good to pray about various situations that we may find ourselves in life and act accordingly. But to love and forgive is a task of a victim soul that does come up in our lives. And as I gave the Saul and David example and the David and Goliath example, it's sort of a matter of, it's a matter of discerning what example is best at what given time. And it's ideal, of course, if we can love and forgive and bring beauty, truth, and goodness out of any situation. And it doesn't always happen that way. That's when we move into truth, beauty, and goodness in battling a moral and ethical wrong and sticking with it and trying to get help, trying to get righteousness for righteousness' sake accomplished. And that also takes finesse, courage, a certain calm, and a risk that we will lose our good name. And we're doing it for sometimes a stranger, where we see that something has happened that's wrong against a person. But it works out then in our everyday experiences to get to stand up for the person who's being wronged in a situation. So to choose truth, beauty, and goodness is always a conscious decision. I think it can be a conscious decision for someone who is going to carry the mantle, so to speak, of someone who has been wronged and carry it to the next step in our workplace, in our social lives, in our friendships, and to choose equanimity of spirit and loving forgiveness is always of first order to try, to attempt. And when that doesn't work, if that doesn't fall into place in the situation, then we go on forward with what we have witnessed and come to truth, beauty, and goodness in a person's particular situation then, where we bring about truth, beauty, and goodness to others and pray to forgive and to continue to love, no matter what the situation happens to be. And there's great power in love and forgiveness. That's what I observed in a profound way. And of all the graciousness and of all the people who love and esteem this person who chose to love and forgive, or to forgive someone and to continue to love them, to appreciate and hold on to a friendship, despite what the person had done. And not that the friendship will always be the same again. There can be mistrust that is right to have. Maybe the person isn't to be trusted, but the person can still be loved and forgiven, and then go on in the relationship with one another, a work relationship, a friendship relationship involving other people who are aware of the situation and can be profoundly, positively affected to see that one person chose to take the narrow path, the higher ground, and to pray, love, and forgive the person in the situation who wronged another person. I haven't seen it so cut and dried for quite a while in my life to see a situation like that. Even when a person is done wrong, good can be brought out of it. Good and beauty and truth. So, Heart of Jesus, victim of love. This is a prayer that I had forgotten about. And it was from years ago at Abbey of Gethsemane in Trappist, Kentucky. I was there on a retreat, just a private, silent retreat myself, with other people you can go there and leave a donation. They appreciate a donation and stay in their guest house and go to the masses and go to confession. And you can best to call ahead of time to make sure they have room, and log in a spot, get yourself a place, a reservation, and then you can leave a donation when you're there. You can eat. It's done in private and in silence, or you can go with other people, but you agree, if you're going to speak, you must get so many yards or out of distance of others, not to disturb the silence, because the Cistercians have times of silence. They're in silence, other than, say, if they meet each other or are working together. If they need to say something, they can whisper something in their daily manual labors and things. But otherwise, and in Mass, they speak, of course, and sing and chant. But otherwise, they observe silence. I think it is during, they have one area for the retreatants that if you want to be in a non-speaking area in total silence, or to be in an area where you can speak with others who are there for a retreat during mealtime. So I was there, and there was a lovely Cistercian brother. He'd been there for years. I didn't know a lot about him until I found his obituary online. It was maybe a year later or 2 years later, I realized I couldn't get a hold of him, and realized that he had passed away. I knew he was having medical problems, and I sensed they were serious by how his demeanor and how he spoke to me. But he met me one morning and just whispered, which was allowed. He said, "You communicate with the Lord, don't you?" And I wasn't sure what to say. And he said something to the effect, "Well, I didn't mean to embarrass you," or anything, or, you want to be private. But he says, "I can sense, I can tell that you have a close relationship with God, and that he communicates with you." And I admitted, yes, sometimes I get messages and things, and he says, "That's wonderful, it's all fine." He says, "I want to show you something that came to me that's very beautiful." And it was. And it had to do with being a victim soul, of which he understood himself. Here he was going through a final type of suffering. Some test results were coming back, and he was having treatments. And so he showed me this prayer, and he had drawn an image, just a very basic image. I'm going to try to find it, which is good luck to me here. Might be in a file cabinet, if I can get to the file cabinet in the garage. Or it might be just in some loose papers in a closet. But the prayer is this: "Heart of Jesus, victim of love, vouchsafe that I become a living, holy, loving holocaust in thy sight. Heart of Jesus, victim of love, vouchsafe that I become a loving, living, holy holocaust in thy sight." And I'll repeat it again when I can read it and see it exactly. He had drawn a picture of Jesus' Sacred Heart, of a person on one end, the Sacred Heart up here, and then the Eucharist, Holy Communion, the chalice of Christ's blood and the host of his body, and showed these in little stick figures practically, very basic imagery with arrows, and it all connected in a union of the Sacred Heart, ourselves, and the Eucharist, all in a type of directional motion of one to the next. And it could go either, go back and forth, because the the Sacred Heart was up here. So either way, from Eucharist to person with Sacred Heart to Sacred Heart connecting, or from person to Eucharist with Sacred Heart connecting. And the heart was pierced by a lance. So these arrows were like lances, each direction going and piercing the Sacred Heart. And he gave me a copy of that image that he had drawn. He had had this vision type situation where he had seen the relationship of Christ, of the Sacred Heart, and victim souls. So he told me, Brother Rene told me that I would find joy in repeating this prayer. Heart of Jesus, victim of love, vouchsafe that I become a living, holy, pleasing holocaust in thy sight. That's the correct way. Correct words. Heart of Jesus, victim of love, vouchsafe that I become a living, holy, pleasing holocaust in thy sight. And I went along, this was back in 2005. And I think it was probably by 2007. We had spoken on the phone a couple of times since, but I didn't hear then. And it was about 2007 that I found online that his obituary, and then some background of him, his simple background growing up near Trappist, Kentucky, and how he had felt this call, and he couldn't be a priest, or education-wise, or it was discerned. He took the humble path of a brother, Cistercian Brother, and he had lived there since he was like 20 or 22 years old, and he was maybe early 70s when he passed away, and had been a mainstay there at the monastery, at the Abbey of Gethsemane, all those years, and had seen priests come and go, come there, live there, and pass away. And then it was his turn. But I knew by this prayer that he understood that I was a victim soul. And it was about that time I was coming into understanding that people who suffer, that there is a category for us. And it's that of the victim soul. It's our place in the church. Just as is being a hermit is a sort of a place, a designated area, designated zone. And we can make our offering to God very simply in private. There again, it's always good to have spiritual advisor, at least for a time period, and to help us grow in this vocation of suffering, for example. But to make an offering of our sufferings is a simple matter of talking it over with God and offering ourselves as a victim soul. And this prayer can be a repeated reminder and tool, and a reminder of the rather cyclical or symbiotic relationship of our soul with the Sacred Heart of Jesus, with his body and his blood, the Eucharist. And I really liked that vision that Brother Rene had, that understanding, that visual that he had been shown of the great relationship between the Sacred Heart of Jesus and all of us who suffer. And everyone will suffer at some point in time or another. It's a universal bond, and understanding is suffering. And I think I did come to more of a zeal, at least that much of joy, back when I was repeating that prayer, because it helped me ponder. That prayer helped me ponder Christ and the relationship and the hardships that a victim soul can go through in a temporal type way, just as I've been having increased suffering. It's been very difficult. I'm awake now because of my hand starting this terrible nerve pain and numbness coming down my arm from my upper back. In fact, I show you what I use if I can find it here. Oh, maybe I dropped it. There are 2 lacrosse balls that are taped together with black tape, and I position them underneath me and behind, right at a muscle point that is painful in my upper left back. And it presses in on it then, and sometimes can do like a trigger point. And I don't know what. Oh, no, that's not it. That's my heat pack. Been using a heat pack for my gut because I had a terrible gut attack yesterday morning. First one in 7 weeks since I've been taking this supplement, this peptide supplement that is supposed to help the neurological signals get straightened out in the intestines and go to the right location to trigger the right motion to return motility to intestines. And this supplement's been helpful with people with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, with Crohn's disease, and other motility issues, which somebody with arachnoiditis eventually will have, usually does, according to what I've found online. That's the usual trajectory. And mine's been going on for a while, just this gradual buildup into paralysis of the intestines. So I had this attack yesterday morning, and it was terrible. It came on suddenly, and it was practically too much to cope with how quickly it came on. But I got the heat pack. I used castor oil. I bought a gallon of it. I use castor oil a lot now for my knee pain, to keep that arthrofibrotic tissue down as low as possible, so it's not just so big around my underneath the skin in my knee replacement, that it's very painful also. So the castor oil keeps that swelling down and does as best as anything can with the tissue, really rather miraculously, but I have to do it all the time the rest of my life. And then I put a heat pack on it to help the oil soak in. Well, I put castor oil all over my abdomen and used the puppy pad. And it has plastic on the outside. I cut it in half. I'd had a little puppy before these 2 that was sold me, and it was very sick. And so I did not keep it. I let the breeder handle it, because it was a type of ailment that could go on with the puppy for a long time, and I had to use prudence. I didn't have indefinite funds for vet bills and things, and I felt terrible for the little puppy, but it was very sick. But the breeder had used puppy pads in the training of her puppies. So I had these puppy pads. These 2 dogs didn't need puppy pads. They were trained very quickly, but just taking them outside. But so you put a pad like that has a plastic coating on it, because the oil otherwise will get all over your bedding or your clothing. But I slathered that on, put the puppy pad over with the plastic side up, and then a heat pack on that to help get that oil to go in and help my abdomen distend it out immediately, within like 2 minutes. It was hard, painful, and distended out like I was pregnant, maybe 6 months pregnant. I'm too old for that. My skin doesn't stretch well. It was so painful, and I will say it was discouraging because I hadn't had an attack for 7 weeks. I thought they were done with, but no. And I realized I hadn't been drinking enough. I have to keep drinking all the time. So, it's still a problem. I just got the heat pack up in the night to help get the stomach done. And after I'm done talking, I'm going to get the ice pack to use on my back, and then I wrap a big one around my arm to get this nerve pain down. And the nerve pain isn't at a peak at this point. It's just working up. It's building up. So I've had this increased suffering. And I started to wonder why I would have such an onslaught of added suffering. And I thought, I wonder if the devil's unhappy. Because that has happened before. And it does with us. When we come onto something and have an understanding of something. Like I had this profound understanding of the power of love and forgiveness. Praying, and I don't know if this person I observed has been praying. I don't know that. But I could tell by what was spoken by announcers that the person had retained or redeveloped the relationship with this one who had done the person wrong, had and not anything illegal, but it was unkind the way it was handled, very unkind, and not anything that you could easily trust the person again. But it reminded me of David with Saul, and the love that David had, the love and respect and forgiveness for Saul, and wanted to retain the friendship with Saul. David loved Saul, didn't want this animosity. Saul had become very envious of David and very embittered and fearful that David was better and would take over. Well, David was better. He was a better leader. And he was anointed by God to take over from Saul. With that was going to be what was going to happen. And Saul didn't like that. So Saul conspired to have David killed. And tried, 2 or 3 times. This is all, I think, in 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1st Samuel, you can read about all this. It's a very fascinating study of characters, of our characters and of human nature, and how we can have Saul did like David, but the envy took over. The vice took over the goodness, the truth, beauty, and goodness. So in the end, God decided, and Saul died. Saul was taken. And David became king, King David. So I thought about that, just understanding how great is choosing love and forgiveness over keeping an animosity going or a hurt going. Even if in prudence you're not going to really be all that trusting of a person, totally, you can still love them and forgive them and retain some friendship, courtesy, graciousness. And that's what I had noticed in the past few days watching this person in professional sports capacity. Having the person as an opponent in one instance and as a partner in another. How beautifully and graciously this person comported herself in this sport. And the announcers talked about it, about how the person had retained the friendship, even though they weren't specifically partnering anymore in a ongoing way as they had the year before. And that, of course, was by the other person's decision to, who had I would say didn't handle the situation in the best way, wasn't upfront about something, and ended up very hurtful, kind of a behind the back maneuvering for power. And then here I am, though, realizing, learning from this younger person, in observing in a situation in life through a computer screen, basically, this profound power. The greatest power is the power of loving forgiveness. That unites us with God when we love and forgive others. And obviously, if the other persons are in a capacity to do us harm, like abuse us, or if the other is a child or something and defenseless, or can happen in elder abuse, even in nursing homes or in family settings. You cannot, or in a work situation like the other example I was giving of a supervisor who was wronging an employee. It was a way to get rid of the person, had a personal vendetta and gripe. And that was the easier way out, was to make up something negative about the person, say that they had done this or that at work when they hadn't. And only one other person witnessed it and came forward to his immediate supervisor, and that person opted not to do anything about it, sort of for political maneuvering situation got involved. And the person who was going to report it is still going to take it to higher levels, because there's a responsibility when we witness a wrong and a person is defenseless. It's just his word or her word against a supervisor. But in the situation then that I was observing in the last few days, there was this profound growth that I was having, this proof, if you will, that God was showing me that when at all possible, and in other situations, choose loving forgiveness always over harboring anger and resentment and cutting people off because of their doing wrong. And this has implications for me with my former spouse too. I have forgiven the person, but maybe not fully, or maybe not in a way that left the situation open-ended for family. So anyway, it's the loving forgiveness of going forward with trusting and praying and forgiving in a situation such as I was confronted with in dealing with those who are trying to love and forgive and go forth in loving relationship with one another. And that includes in forgiving others in friendships or in workplace or in families, as hard as it can be. If we can, it's best to forgive and to move on and to let go. And forgive and love and forgive. The victim soul offering can be based around this little prayer. Heart of Jesus, victim of love, vouchsafe. Vouchsafe means to ensure. Make sure. Vouchsafe that I become a living, holy, pleasing holocaust in thy sight. A holocaust, an immolation, an offering of ourselves to be placed on an altar and consumed by fire, basically. That's a holocaust. To die to ourselves to that extent, that we are willing to give our lives for situations, for people, for wrongs committed. Heart of Jesus, victim of love. Victim of love. Jesus was a victim of love. Vouchsafe that I become a living, holy, pleasing holocaust in thy sight. So, Brother Rene further talked to me about this, and I already explained the little symbol, this motion of an arrow, a lance, coming from us into the Sacred Heart, back out into the Eucharist. A chalice and a host he drew, and back into us and on into the Sacred Heart. So Brother Rene said that the more the prayer is repeated, and he says even in front of a crucifix or at communion time, to say that prayer, we can live out in our mind and in our relationship with the Sacred Heart of Jesus this offering of our giving ourselves to God. Heart of Jesus, victim of love, vouchsafe that I become a living, holy, pleasing, and holy sacrifice in thy sight. And Brother Rene spoke to me then about the illustration depicting a large heart with a lance piercing it. The heart is Jesus's heart and could represent also the heart of a victim soul. That we unite ourselves with Jesus. We unite our hearts with the Sacred Heart. And drops of blood came from the pierced heart, Jesus' Sacred Heart, and dropped into the chalice of his living blood. And so the chalice caught the drops from the pierced heart that was above the chalice, and above the chalice in this illustration was a host, a large host, and of which the victim soul, the person, eats and drinks Christ's real body and drinks his real blood. And the joy is the result of this action. Joy is the result of communion, our co-mingling, our co-union with Christ, with his Sacred Heart, and with the blood that was shed for our salvation and for the reparation for our sins and the sins of all mankind. So when we, as victim souls, receive communion, this can be in temporal mode at Mass, in tangible form of consecrated host and consecrated blood, or in mystical communion, in spiritual communion, within ourselves, within our mind, that has joined, united with Christ, if we cannot get to Mass or do not have someone bringing communion. And if you're a hermit, there may become a time in your life that you will not be going to a parish at all, and don't need to. As we grow in faith, to spiritual communion and remaining in Christ's love becomes a reality, to the point that we are in union with Christ increasingly. His real presence is with us always, because we remain in his love and his love remains in us, because we abide in God and God abides in us. So this action of communion, co-union, and commitment with Christ and his Sacred Heart is a very real event. It's an actuality. And as victim souls, this action is also very much integral. Christ's blood dropping into the chalice, the host above the blood, Christ's body, and we give ourselves. We are being sacrificed in union with Christ as victim souls. We become with him the loving, pure, the living, holy, pleasing Holocaust in God's sight, in his sight. We become part of this process of victim soulhood in communion, in Holy Communion, at Mass and in spiritual communion, when we're in our hermitages or our hospital room or nursing home or abode, wherever we are, and we have communion of either form, mystical, spiritual, or tangible, temporal. This participation occurs, this flow of us being part of Jesus' Sacred Heart, which contains and supplies the blood for the chalice and the body for the host, that people then consume and become victim souls, become a part of. We become united. And Brother Rene, in mentioning that the more that I would repeat this prayer, the more the process will be ingrained and there will be a joy. And I have been repeating, and I've brought up again after years of not, this victim soul life and the meaning of it and the beauty of it, the reality of it, of being a living, holy, pleasing Holocaust in Christ's sight, in his Sacred Heart, in God's sight. And that, of course, can trigger the evil one who doesn't want us having this union and offering ourselves over and over as a living, holy, pleasing Holocaust in God's sight, and offering the union of us with Christ's Sacred Heart, and to communicate with Christ silently or with words or within our hearts, however it's done. There are, of course, evil forces that do not want that and do not want others to become victim souls, other people who suffer, to realize, even someone who has witnessed something and is sticking their own neck out to be a living, holy, pleasing Holocaust, to be willing to risk themselves on behalf of someone who was wrongfully terminated. That's an example of someone who is a situational victim soul in that right. If they choose to offer whatever sufferings they will incur by standing up for this person who was wrongly terminated and reporting what that person witnessed was the conversation, which by that time the supervisor in charge of this person who got terminated used it to terminate the person. That was a easy way to get rid of someone the person didn't want around, and had no conscience, evidently, of what losing a job can do to a person. Ironically, when I found out about this other situation going on, and the courage and the strength and the prayers this person needs to go into battle, and the person has the Joan of Arc prayer on his person to pray it for courage and strength to go into battle to right the wrongs of this situation, because that person happened to be a witness to it and knows, so has spoken up. And there can be ramifications when we speak up, when we're a whistleblower and say, no, enough of that. That isn't how it should be done, and that's not right, because the person who's terminated has no voice now, gone off the premises. So, and other things were said about the person that are highly unlikely to be true. So it was a wrongful termination of this employee. And the person who's standing up for the person, and at least wanting truth to come out, needs our prayers and can, if he or she wants, make a victim soul offering. Because that person could have some ramifications for standing up against the supervisor that's doing wrong. At least wrong in the wrongful firing and in the bullying that went on to try to get this other person out unfairly, so unjustly, in a most uncharitable way. And then that reminded me, I had watched a movie when I found out about this. I think it was Friday night or Saturday night. Might have been Saturday night. Since I can't sleep, I found this British show with the British accents that help put me to sleep. They're so lyrical and musical sounding to my ear anyway, the accent of the British people. So it was called Mr. Bates versus the Postal System. It's a true-to-life situation that occurred within the last 15 years in Great Britain. And it was a terrible thing. And the postal mistresses and masters who own their own businesses and sublet from the post office, buy their stamps and everything from the post office, the main governmental group. But a new computer system had been installed in the UK several years ago, and there was a problem with it, bugs in the system. And also employees of the computer system company could go in without the postmaster or mistress knowing and create deficits in their accounts of what they owed the government for supplies bought, or what they were reporting as could change those numbers of their sales, what they reported as sales. And of course, it all had to tally out at the end of each month, but it wasn't. And so people would call the postal system, the ones who owned their businesses, and would ask for help in getting it figured out. And sometimes would get the help, but most of the time wouldn't. And never the right help when it was given. A lot of corruption going on, plus incompetency. Both were going on. And this one man, Mr. Bates, decided to do something about it. He knew there had to be other people, not just himself, who had these problems. And he found out, really, within a couple of years, there were over 560 people who had grievances with the postal system and how that was going to play out. And he got somebody to take it to court and to take action on the wrongs that were going on. And ironically, a couple of women were at the top of the governmental positions of the Postal Service at that time, and were sweeping it under the rug. One of them also had another spot in government, so politically didn't want the problem. So just swept it all under the rug, and at least one person killed himself over all that had happened to him. So it was getting very serious, the wrongs that were going on, and very literal. So we'll see what's what with, hopefully, with the person that we know about who's trying to fight a wrong. And in Great Britain, Mr. Bates persevered and won out. The truth was found out. The people's names were cleared. They were not stealing from their own business. But it was very sad they didn't get all their money back. But they're still trying. They're trying to get all their money back, because some of them remortgaged their homes. Their parents remortgaged their homes to pay off what they thought would be a one-time debt, even though it wasn't right. Some of them opted to do that rather than go to jail. This got serious. It's considered, I think, they're saying with this movie, and there's also a documentary talking about it that's been produced on Amazon Prime, it is, of the wrongs that were done, and tried to keep hush-hush, because the upper echelons of the postal system, these women didn't want the trouble. They didn't want to look bad for other career aspirations they had. So it got very ugly, very, very human sin. And I think Mr. Bates was continuing to work on getting everyone's money back. They got some back, but not all, from the wrongdoings. Anyway, that's sort of an aside, but it gives examples of the real life situations that we can get into, and that we should get into in some instances. If we witness a corruption or a wrongdoing, and other people are being caused harm by it, we have a moral obligation to stand up and say, hey, I saw this, to report to the right person. And sometimes that person won't want to deal with it. Then we have the responsibility to go beyond that person, even though it gets riskier and riskier for ourselves. It's that risk that's part of being a living, holy, pleasing holocaust in God's sight. Reading about David and Saul in 1 Samuel and a little bit in 2 Samuel is very good to do, because it shows this whole human dilemma of someone who went bad. Saul lost his courage and entertained wrong. And it was the beginning of the end for him for doing so. And then we have the other situations in which we can choose to fight and to hold grudges and nurse the wounds, even if we're not consciously aware we are. Or our life has been such that what happened to us years ago still affects us. It's best to forgive, to pray, love, and forgive in those cases. Unless there's something tangible we can do to right the wrong, to bring justice after so many years. It's best to let it play itself out and to pray for the other person who wronged us, love the person who wronged us, but pray, love, forgive, move on with our lives. And as I mentioned, the power of loving forgiveness was overwhelming me on the weekend to see how beloved the person who chose that high ground was by everyone. The goodness of the person was noted by others. Even people watching, fans. Fans love and trust the person who forgave and moved on, kept the head up, didn't get into a grudge situation or a poor me, but just kept working hard and at their career, their sport, and persevered through, and still loved and cared about the person who had wronged them, forgave that person. I'm not saying, and I don't know if the person totally trusts the person. I don't think so. If they do wrong like that and show no remorse or that they're going to change, we can still love and forgive them. We don't have to just keep handing ourselves over for this, like the lamb to the slaughter, intentionally so. But we can bury the hatchet for our own sake also, to forgive and to love the person, have compassion, because it's not natural. It's we humans weren't created to do evil, to do wrong. That came in the fall with the through the scenario that we see in the Adam and Eve situation of our human selves falling to temptation of the evil one, and we then sin. But there are means to overcome sin. Jesus overcame the darkness. The light overcame the dark. And being a victim soul is a means of being a living, holy, pleasing holocaust, an immolation, if you will, on the altar of love of Christ, on Christ's altar, so to speak, to be united with Christ in suffering, in dying to ourselves, and in making reparation for the wrongs that are done all the time, all over the world. And there's a loving power in that process of love and forgiveness, of the wrongs that are being done, of things we're not even that specifically aware, but we've offered ourselves as victim souls, as loving, living, holy, pleasing holocausts in God's sight. In talking with Brother Rene and the joy that can come, and I admit I haven't had so much joy lately because of the added sufferings, which, however, I suspect is the evil one, not even liking me talking about being a victim soul. Even someone such as, if we see something wrong and decide to stand up for righteousness' sake, we can offer ourselves as a situational victim soul because we're going to be attacked, or we could be. by a supervisor or another supervisor who wanted to keep it swept under the rug, for example. So there's always risks in life. And when we are suffering, offering our sufferings to God as victim souls, it's not an automatic pass. We can end up having more sufferings. The devil doesn't like it, doesn't like what we're doing, offering ourselves on behalf of others, and to suffer on behalf of others. So I talked further here with Brother Rene, and the thought came up of when we make one step forward to Christ with our offering, Christ makes leaps and bounds back for us. Any show on our part of desire and loving forgiveness, God comes back with munificence, with magnanimous love and help for us to do what we are offering to do, to offer ourselves to help in this whole process of really what is a salvation process, over and over and over. Yes, Jesus was crucified once and for all for our sins and for our salvation, but the suffering continues. The suffering goes on and on and on, and that's okay. That's part of the process. So let me get my glasses up here close. The Eucharist is very real strength as a physical and supernatural food. Come forward in our lives as victim souls, and keep moving forward in loving forgiveness. There is a power and a beauty in that type of offering of ourselves for God. There are three different points to be made for victim souls that I will repeat here. This came from the Guide for Victim Souls of the Sacred Heart, this little book that explains and helps with relating the theology of suffering and the truths of the Catholic Church as an example, as a benefit of the theology of suffering. John Paul II wrote in a encyclical, Salvific Dolores, it's called, about suffering. And this though comes from the guidebook. 1. Victim souls offer themselves to the Sacred Heart to atone for their own sins and for the deep ingratitude and offenses committed against our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. 2. They, victim souls, work and offer themselves especially for the conversion of sinners. Millions of souls are swallowed up by ignorance and evil. The victim soul volunteers to save them from the damnation into which they are drifting. Not only an occasional prayer or an occasional good work, but all the works and sacrifices of his or her whole life are directed to obtain the one thing necessary, the grace of God. That's the one thing necessary for all of us, is the grace of God. Again, find this part. Oh, the main purpose in all the victim souls do is to make reparation for sin, although this does not prevent us, victim souls, from other kinds of prayer and intentions. Meditating on the heinousness of ingratitude and on the love and thirst of Christ for souls, victim souls can become consciously aflame with the love of atonement. And that's what happened with Blessed Alexandrina. She became inflamed herself with this desire, with this thirst to help souls, to help make atonement. And I had mentioned in one of my videos that I erased because I would keep falling asleep. I'm so fatigued from all this pain. That I haven't had that flame, that yearning, that thirsting for souls to help. And I'm praying that will return. And I think it will if I just repeat the prayer now and then throughout the day, and especially when I'm suffering to a point that I feel like I can't bear it anymore. With this burning arm pain, it's horrible, and it's right about this time period it starts in, but since I'm sitting up and moving a little bit, it's holding it off, but the fingers are like fire. That's a flame. But my heart and soul and mind need to become inflamed with this love, this loving forgiveness and offering of my suffering, because otherwise it's just wasted. It's wasted, and it just becomes a panic in the night. It's just a panic in the night unless I offer it lovingly, in a living way, in a holy way to Christ, to utilize for whatever way he wills, whatever way God can utilize, because suffering is powerful, pain is powerful, and pain and love, as we remember from that image that Brother Rene had, that vision of the Sacred Heart and the piercing of that heart and the blood dripping into the chalice and the host above the chalice, but the blood was dripping from Jesus' Sacred Heart. And we were part of that cycle, victim souls are. Part of the cycle of uniting ourselves with Christ and with his wounded Sacred Heart. Because of our wounds, our suffering, that helps bind us to Christ's suffering. So that's where the joy and the honor come in, to be united with Christ in that way, in that intimate suffering, which does become very intimate when we are going through the depths of suffering. The third part here is a victim soul. Souls have a special love for the priesthood. Well, I think I mentioned they work and offer themselves especially for the conversion of sinners, and how millions of souls are swallowed up by ignorance and evil. And that even a prayer from us will help the situation. A prayer or an occasion to do a good work, to do something good for someone else, or to offer humility even. I apologize to my neighbor on the phone for how my slovenly ways. We had a storm here and the mailbox flew off and down the street. Her husband went to get it. I'm grateful that it didn't hit someone's car, the mailboxes that flew in the storm. And I need to figure out a way to fix that. The metal pieces that screwed the mailboxes screw into are broken, and I don't have soldering equipment, nor have I ever soldered. But I would sure give it a try if I knew. I always try. I try to do my best, but I've been down with so much pain and suffering. And I have so many other tasks. I hadn't been eating properly. Today, when I got the gut attack under somewhat control, thanks be to God, I needed to bake some vegetables and get them in containers so I have something to eat this week that's healthy. And I've got to remember to keep drinking water, because I think that's what helped bring on the gut attack. I hadn't been drinking enough water. So it's part of the work of a victim soul is doing right even in our own lives. And so I apologize to the neighbor for how I have to live. I don't know if I'm going to get better from this. I never do when I get into worse pain situations, or why I have such extreme, I have fatigue because I can't sleep well with all this pain. And at this point in time, my pain doctor has flaked out. Essentially, he's says get an internist. Well, I can't even get in until mid-September. There's only one in this whole area that's even taking patients. One doctor. So it's just not so easy. But the pain doctor doesn't realize this. But all of a sudden he felt overloaded with too much. He had been pinch hitting for me. He would have called in a Medrol dose pack for me in past times, but not now. So I'm on my own, suffering this out, and somehow the neurosurgeon's PA still hasn't called one in. I'm sure that would help with the inflammation going on that's causing a lot of pain from the muscle and from my neck. But so a victim soul has circumstances like that. The devil may be involved in it, sure, true, misunderstanding and causing more suffering, but it's something the victim soul must forgive, pray about, love those who don't understand, forgive, and live our lives. Humble down. So I'm going to try to figure out something with that mailbox, besides a bungee cord around it, which I had tried before, and that finally broke, got dried by the sun and broke. So, and the postman's so kind. He knows I'm not doing well, and don't worry about it. Doesn't bother us, And but I needed to fix it, secure it, and that's why I'd been trying hard to do more with my yard and the outside, calm down the HOA people, because I don't intentionally want to cause trouble. And that's part of what a victim soul needs to do, is to be loving and forgiving and understanding of those, like in the St. Francis prayer, St. Francis of Assisi, to understand even when we're not understood. That's love, that's forgiveness. So victim souls offer ourselves especially for the conversion of sinners, and for those people who aren't even serious sinners, who are just occasional or don't even realize that their standards are being unreasonable for someone who's in a tight spot suffering-wise. And God has allowed me to be in this tight spot right now. So I have full faith in God that He's allowed this for good reasons. And part of it was to return to becoming more consciously aware of victim soul and the offerings that are made and why we make them, and the beauty of it, and the connection with communion with Christ and with Eucharist. The third thing is victim souls have a special love for the priesthood. They labor and offer themselves for priests to obtain abundant blessings on their apostolic work through the ordained ministers in holy orders of the Church, or, if you're a Protestant, ordained ministers in your churches. We glorify God on earth. Victim souls glorify God on earth by offering ourselves for abundant blessings for priests and ministers. And we glorify God on earth spreading the kingdom of God on earth, and sanctify souls more and more as a result of our support of those who lead souls in churches, in parishes, in congregations. The victim souls are the hidden power to make priests zealous and effective in the confessional, on the pulpit, and with the dying. They don't know it. We don't need to go tell them. It's best not to report, I think, even what's going on in our prayer life, unless there's a specific message for someone. But otherwise, just graciously quietly go about our efforts, our sacrificing as victim souls, our love and our offering of ourselves in this co-communion redemptive effort with Jesus Christ. And as I said before, the more we take a step, even a tiny step toward Christ, he responds with a major step toward us, open arms, reaching out to us, all the help that we could possibly need or want. I had to admit, when I was writing this, and after talking with Brother Rene back in 2005, I didn't realize the profound vastness of victim soulhood. Here was this brother, the Cistercian brother, who was a victim soul. He'd had that image come to him and he drew it out of the connectedness of victim souls with communion and with Christ in communion, of our co-union with Christ. So it's a beautiful thing. It's not ugly. It's not strange or bizarre. There's nothing. A couple of people have dropped off, and maybe it's because of this. I don't know. They're talking about being a victim soul. Christ is a victim of love. There's nothing wrong with taking the suffering that we're allowed and that God gives us. It is a gift in many ways. I did come to that point years ago of understanding that the suffering I was given is a gift from God. So I have that attitude, that understanding of the beauty and the giftedness of it. And I'm understanding more now in just reviewing what I'd written years ago, the organization of it. I think in here I talk about John Paul II's encyclical, Salvific Dolores, and the power of suffering, the saving graces of offering sufferings and utilizing our sufferings, not letting it go to waste. So, this is the friend in another time zone who keeps forgetting. Ordinarily, I wouldn't want to be wakened up at 4 something in the morning, but since I've been ill, I'm always awake at this time, trying to deal with this arm. So I will stop with all this and go get my ice pack. And yes, taking care of our suffering can be a suffering. The pain of the ice pack on my arm and my upper back is not pleasant on the body either. It hurts, but we'll make it. And we offer our love for God, for Christ. God bless His real presence in us. Let us keep going for the love of Christ. Let us be a living, holy, loving sacrifice, holocaust in thy sight. God bless His real presence in us. And leave comments, anything you want, and topics that you may prefer that I turn to talking of something else for a while.